Atari Games. Atari Games full-time employee. I had known Atari's consumer division vice president Steve Calfee from my contract work on Cyberball for the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES. And so I had a foot in the door at Atari Games. Steve oversaw console video game development for platforms like the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, Sega Master System, the Sega CD, the Sega Genesis, and the Sega 32X, and so forth. There were so many platforms and cross-platform developments that were critical for cost management and players having consistent experiences despite whatever machine they may have purchased a game for. It was a complicated business. I bargained with Steve that I would work on my own original video games within a small team inside Atari Games. I asked that they would hire me, give me a salary, and give me bonuses on any games like a royalty that I made. I suppose I was rather presumptuous. But Steve had different ideas. He wanted more for Atari than just my making original games that he could sell. He wanted technical support for struggling developers within Atari's console video game division. He wanted me to be his tech guru to firefight any projects that got in trouble and to solve the most complex problems. To me, whatever, that sounded and proved to be very easy for me. In fact, I think being developer support added to my range of skills and my exposure to a very wide range of challenges, if not outright insane code and engineering designs. I learned a lot working for Atari. Later in life, engineers would joke that I had the engineering force like a Jedi, and that I could just feel and sense where bugs or problems were in source code or hardware. Steve Calfee was so impressed with my talent that he would joke I was overclocked like a Pentium processor, which at the era was one of the fastest computer chips in the world. He meant it as a huge and great compliment. Conversely, Steve called me the most straight shooter that he had ever known, which he intended as derogatory. It was clear that he was suggesting that I would be much better off by not saying things so directly without filters, that I should edit what I say to other people so they are more likely to embrace or accept it. Steve's perspective would recur throughout my career, with many people saying things like that. You don't belong in the White House. You belong in the field, on the wall, somewhere far away from politics, and instead can focus on winning and succeeding. It was obvious. My employers wanted me for my raw abilities and talents, and they did not want me in their lives, in their business, or anywhere that they might be. I was a necessary part of their operation, but it was a part of their operation they preferred work somewhere out of sight. I resigned 3 times from Atari. The first time resulted in a generous counteroffer to stay and keep doing what I did for Atari. Firefight flailing external development problems and projects, and make games internally in between. Things were weird, and my resignation took the 3rd time that I resigned, after sitting in with the CEO, Dan Van Alderen, in his office from afternoon to midnight. Dan Van, as people called him, towered above people at almost 7 feet tall. He drove a custom modified Mercedes so that he could fold himself into and out of it. Dan was innately intimidating. And add to that his gray eyes staring down on you with long, awkward, silent minutes. Yes, minutes. He could make anyone feel very uncomfortable. Dan mastered the art of emotional and psychological control. He would just keep talking and talking, trying to convince me that it was in my best interest to stay with Atari. He offered a down payment on a house in Cupertino, a big advance on future bonuses. He said my newborn daughter deserved better. What he was offering now, and how selfish I was to not accept his offer, because my daughter would suffer because of it. He asked how I could be so disloyal to Atari. But every offer had strings attached to it. They were like indentured service for years. I would no longer have the option to quit without severe financial and legal repercussions. Atari figured their complex play with me would work with a very intricate web. It would lock me in. Well, what precipitated that last resignation from Atari? Well, Atari Games and Tengen had been transferred as assets to Time Warner and merged with their already existing computer game interactive video group in LA. That group was called Time Warner Interactive Group. They went by TWIG. The merged Atari and TWIG companies were reflagged simply as Time Warner Interactive. Time Warner installed a senior executive to be adult supervision to oversee Time Warner's investment for fiscal returns and appropriate public appearances due to it now being a total shareholder visible company. There were expectations. Atari had never been a corporate culture entity, and it was arguably the opposite of propriety. Atari Games staff drank alcohol and consumed illicit drugs, often, if not daily. The culture of Atari was one of freedom and wild abandon, and of creative passion. It did not expect employees to partake, but it did look the other way, and it even accommodated the most veteran of developers. People were not happy with their first impressions of Time Warner's assuming the control of Atari. After Time Warner had established its senior executive adult supervision overlord from its board of directors, things became ever weirder every week. It seemed like Time Warner was intent on disrupting Atari's free-flowing life and work style and replacing it with a more traditional tech company culture. They did not appreciate that some employees openly expressed approval for illegal drug use and excessive partying and booze consumption. Drug tests. That was the memo. All employees will submit to a drug test or face immediate employment termination. Well, that was not a good story for Atari. This was not far from the legendary Atari Corp. Not Atari Games, Atari Corp's Jack Tramiel's towel designer major mistake. We can talk more on that later. Within the span of maybe 18 hours, half of Atari Games employees tendered their resignation. So, it took the day of a memo pretty much from morning to afternoon to the destruction of Atari Games. It was unthinkable what had happened. And Atari Games employees thought it was unthinkable that they would be challenged by a mega corporation to not do drugs. Seriously, I believe more than 3/4 of Atari employees used drugs, illegal drugs, every day. They would all fail the drug test. Time Warner had no choice but to reverse their demand, and they formally dropped the drug test policy just for Atari Games. It had special exclusion. They did not have to be drug clean. And so mote it be. Time Warner indirectly but knowingly blessed Atari Games to use illegal drugs. People were coming to terms with working as a controlled subsidiary of Time Warner. Some of us felt like we were subjugated or otherwise conscripted into working on things that were not as exciting as we once did. Some of us felt like they were wasting our times, our lives. Time Warner alleged employees could pitch new product ideas, but nothing was greenlit. I and many others lost faith in working on fun or new things, at least in the foreseeable future. The wind had left my and many people's sails. In a seemingly olive branch moment, Time Warner gifted every employee a beautiful, pretty desk clock. It was not a big deal really to most people, but it seemed a symbolic gesture that signaled they valued and appreciated the employees after all. The clocks were placed sporadically throughout Atari, coin-op, and consumer Tengen divisions. I suppose the clocks were a moderate hit at first, considering how many people happily placed them on their desks, facing them so they could see the time and date every second of their workday, and reminding them that the company cared. Of course, I do snicker at that and think maybe it's really not a great idea to give employees something that they can put on their desks right in front of them that reminds them how long they are still working. I mean, casinos don't show you time pass for that very reason. They want you to lose track of time and play or work longer. Whatever the reason and the reaction, most people liked their Time Warner branded clocks. Time Warner seemed to forget that Atari had a lot of genius people working for it, and many of those geniuses were engineers who largely learned how to program firmware and games independent of any mentor or school or formal education. They were almost always self-learned, self-taught. Game engineers, especially those dealing with low-level hardware and firmware, are incredibly observant and have a propensity to examine, even deconstruct or disassemble things, reverse engineer, and better understand how do they work. And so, one enterprising engineer took a Time Warner clock apart. The horror of horrors. Time Warner had installed tiny CCTV cameras inside every one of its gifted clocks. They were effectively webcam spy cameras so that management, Time Warner, could watch and monitor employees while at their desks or at someone else's desk. Time Warner asserted the clocks were required, no different than needing a computer or a keyboard. It was part of the workstation. The revolt was on, again. Like Paul Revere's The British Are Coming, influencer employees ran through the halls and to every office to proclaim, "The spies are here, the spies are here." One after another, the clocks were tossed into garbage cans, into dumpsters. Some were smashed and crushed in defiance. People had fun putting the clocks as heads on pikes to showcase their disapproval of being lied to and spied on. I believe one person went outside and drove their car over their clock. All of this transpired in under 24 hours. And in the finale, Time Warner reversed the clock policy and its expectations, just like its drug test. Atari employees were triumphant, but trust in Time Warner was very low.